When I woke up, the first thing I saw was the gun on the nightstand and the ring on my finger. For a long, hazy moment, I didn't move. The world around me was thick with silence, the kind that hums low and heavy after chaos. My head was pounding, my throat dry as ash, and the taste of something metallic clung to the back of my tongue. The sheets beneath me were silk, too soft, too foreign, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and expensive cologne. It was the kind of scent that didn't belong to a stranger. It was possessive, intoxicating, dangerous. I blinked hard, trying to focus, trying to understand where I was, but the ceiling above me was gilded with faint patterns I'd never seen before, and the walls, tall, dark, masculine, seemed to close in as the fragments of memory flickered just out of reach. I pushed myself upright, the sheets falling around me like waves, and that's when I saw him. He was sitting in the corner, half in shadow, a glass of something amber in his hand, his elbows resting on his knees as if he'd been watching me for hours. The light from the window cut across his face in sharp, ruthless angles, and for a second, I forgot how to breathe. He wasn't beautiful. Not in any delicate sense of the word. He was devastating. A kind of raw, controlled power lived in his stillness. Black hair fell over his forehead, and his dark eyes, those impossible, unreadable eyes, were fixed on me with the quiet intensity of someone who owned everything in his sight. My voice came out as a whisper, cracked and hoarse. "Where am I?" He didn't answer right away. He took another slow sip from his glass, the ice clinking softly, and only then did he say, "You're home. Home." The word didn't fit. It was like he'd taken the concept, twisted it into something else, something that belonged entirely to him. I glanced around, my heart thundering. The room was huge, all dark marble and low lighting, with a city skyline stretching far below the floor-to-ceiling windows. Whoever this man was, he lived above the world, looking down on it like a god who'd lost his faith. I opened my mouth to speak again, but my gaze caught on the small velvet box on the nightstand beside the gun. My hand trembled as I reached for it, but I didn't need to open it. The diamond already glinted on my finger, mocking me. What is this?" I stammered, holding up my hand. The ring was heavy, thick gold, expensive beyond reason. "Why am I wearing this?" He stood then, slow and deliberate, his movements too graceful for someone who looked built for violence. "Because you're my wife," he said, his voice low and calm, as if that explained everything, as if that single sentence could possibly make sense of the chaos in my veins. My stomach dropped. "Your what?" "Wife," he repeated, stepping closer. The air shifted around him, a current of danger that made my pulse trip. "We were married last night." I shook my head, backing away until the bed frame pressed against the back of my legs. "That's not possible. I don't even know you." His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Amusement, maybe, or pity. "You knew enough to say yes." "That's insane," I said, my voice rising. "I didn't agree to anything. I would remember—" But even as I said it, my mind betrayed me. There were flashes, bright lights, the taste of champagne, a blurred face leaning close, whispers against my skin. A gunshot in the distance, maybe. A scream. My own voice saying something I couldn't hear. Then nothing. A blackout. He stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see the faint scar along his jawline, the silver watch glinting against his wrist, the quiet, lethal control in every inch of him. "You were drugged," he said simply. "Someone tried to take you last night. I got to you first." His words hit me like a blow. "Take me?" I echoed, my throat tight. "They would have sold you, hurt you, maybe killed you," he said, his tone utterly devoid of emotion, as if these weren't possibilities but facts. "I saved you, Isabella." He said my name like it belonged to him, like it had always belonged to him. My mind was spinning, caught between fear and disbelief. And marrying me, how the hell does that save me? His gaze hardened. Because now you belong to me, and no one touches what's mine. For a moment, the room seemed to shrink, the air thick with something unspoken. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. There was something in his voice, an authority that wasn't just spoken, but woven into the way he existed. He wasn't threatening me. He didn't need to. He was a threat by nature. I stared at him, trying to make sense of this nightmare. "Who are you?" I whispered. "Luca Romano," he said, and the name hit me like lightning. I'd heard it before, in whispered warnings, in late-night news stories about bodies found in rivers, in the way people in my neighborhood used to lower their voices when they said it. He wasn't just anyone. He was the Luca Romano, the most feared mafia boss in the city, the man you didn't cross, didn't look at, didn't even think about if you valued your life. My knees went weak. "You're lying," I said, though the certainty in his expression told me he wasn't. He tilted his head slightly, a ghost of a smile curving his lips. "I don't have to lie to my wife." Panic clawed at my chest. "I want out of this. I want—" "Out?" he interrupted, his voice cutting clean through my fear. "There's no out, Isabella. You walk out that door and they'll find you before nightfall. You'd last maybe 3 hours. With me, you live. Without me—" He let the words hang there, unfinished but complete. I swallowed hard, hating the tremor in my voice. "So what now? You expect me to just— what? Play house with you? Pretend this is normal?" He stepped closer until there was barely an inch between us. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, the faint smell of smoke and danger clinging to him. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face, the touch unexpectedly gentle. "No," he murmured. "I expect you to stay alive. The rest will come later." I froze, unable to look away from him. There was something in his eyes, a darkness I should have feared but instead found myself drawn to, a gravity that pulled at the parts of me I didn't understand. And for a moment, a terrifying, fleeting moment, I wondered if the worst thing that had happened to me that night wasn't marrying him, but the fact that part of me didn't want to run. He straightened, placing the glass back on the table, his every move controlled, deliberate. "You should rest," he said quietly. "You'll need your strength. Things will move fast from here." "What things?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked back at me, his expression unreadable, his voice smooth as sin. "You'll find out soon enough, Mrs. Romano." And as he left the room, the door clicking softly behind him, I stared down at the ring again, the diamond catching the morning light like a cruel joke. My heart was pounding, my thoughts tangled between fear and disbelief, and something darker I couldn't name. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning, because if Luca Romano truly believed I belonged to him, then this wasn't just a mistake. It was a war I hadn't meant to start, and I had no idea how to survive it. The first sound I heard the next morning was the low hum of the city below, the kind of restless vibration that seeps through glass, crawling into your bones until it becomes part of your pulse. And for a long, fragile moment, I almost convinced myself that everything had been a dream, that I hadn't woken up in a stranger's bed with a ring on my finger and a mafia king watching me like I was something he'd bought and paid for. But when I turned my head and saw the velvet box still resting on the nightstand beside the gun, when I caught the faint glint of gold on my hand as the morning light poured through the curtains, reality hit me like a slap. I was still in his world. The sheets were cold, his side of the bed empty, but his presence lingered in the air, that faint trace of smoke and danger and male power that somehow clung to everything he touched. I pressed my fingers to my temple, trying to piece together what had happened, but my memory was still a foggy labyrinth. Faces blurred, voices muffled. The sharp sting of fear when someone's hand had grabbed my arm at that party. The world spinning before everything went black. And then him. Luca Romano. His name alone carried the kind of weight that silenced entire rooms, that made men cross themselves when they spoke it aloud. When I finally gathered enough courage to leave the room, I found myself walking down a hallway that looked like it belonged in a museum. Black marble floors, dark wood paneling, chandeliers that shimmered like they'd been stolen from a cathedral. Every inch of this place screamed money and danger. I could feel eyes on me even when I couldn't see anyone. The air itself seemed alive with quiet surveillance. Somewhere in the distance, voices murmured in Italian, low and sharp like the sound of knives scraping glass. And then he appeared. Luca was standing by the window at the end of the corridor, his silhouette framed by the city skyline, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a phone to his ear. He was speaking in that calm, unhurried tone that carried a quiet threat beneath its surface. When his gaze lifted and found mine, the conversation ended mid-sentence. He slipped the phone away, his lips curving slightly. Not a smile, but something that wanted to be won and never learned how. "You're awake," he said, his voice as smooth as smoke. "I didn't have much of a choice," I replied, trying to summon defiance even as my heart hammered against my ribs. "You kidnapped me." His head tilted, that faint glint of amusement flickering in his eyes. "Kidnapped is such an ugly word. I prefer rescued." "I didn't ask to be rescued," I snapped, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. "No," he said, stepping closer, his presence swallowing the air between us. "But if I hadn't intervened, you wouldn't have lived to ask for anything." Something in his tone, quiet, absolute, sent a chill through me. "What are you talking about? Who were they?" He looked at me for a long moment, studying my face like he was deciding how much truth to give me. Then, in that low, measured voice, he said, "Someone tried to take you from that party. A man I know, someone who works for the Caruso family. You wouldn't have made it out alive, Isabella. When I found you, you were already drugged." The Caruso name sent a flicker of recognition through me. I'd heard it before. In whispers. In the same tone people used for curses. A rival family. Brutal. Unforgiving. I wrapped my arms around myself, my fingers trembling. "So what then? You just decided to make me your wife instead?" His lips curved slightly, but his eyes stayed cold. "I decided to make sure no one else could touch you. A Romano wife is untouchable. No one would dare go near you now." I stared at him, disbelief flooding every nerve. "You think that's normal? You think that's how you save someone?" He shrugged, unbothered. "In my world, protection isn't free. It comes with a price. You're alive because I made sure you belong to me." The words hit me like fire. I wanted to scream, to tell him he was insane. But there was something in his gaze that rooted me to the spot. It wasn't cruelty. It was certainty. He believed every word he said, believed that what he'd done was logical, necessary. And part of me, the part that still remembered the hands dragging me into the dark and the flash of terror before I'd lost consciousness, couldn't completely hate him for it. He turned away, walking toward the dining room, where a long table stretched out beneath a chandelier. A woman I hadn't noticed before, tall, composed, dressed in black, was pouring coffee, her movements precise, efficient. When she glanced at me, her expression didn't change. "Mrs. Romano," she said softly, as if the title were already carved into stone. I followed him, more out of anger than obedience. "I'm not your wife," I said again, though it felt weaker now, like I was trying to convince myself. He sat down at the head of the table, motioning for me to do the same. "You are, Isabella. The papers are signed. The witnesses saw it. You said the words." I don't remember any of that. He poured me coffee, sliding the cup toward me with deliberate calm. Memory doesn't change the truth. I didn't touch the cup. Why me? I demanded. You could have anyone. You could buy anyone. Why risk everything for a woman you don't even know? His eyes met mine then, steady and unreadable. You think I don't know you? He asked quietly. I've known who you are for a long time. The room seemed to tilt slightly. What are you talking about? He leaned back in his chair, his voice almost tender in its restraint. Your father owed money to the Carusos. He borrowed from them to keep his business alive. When he couldn't pay, they came for him. And when he still couldn't pay, they came for you. I stopped them. I made sure they wouldn't touch you. I felt the blood drain from my face. My father. I hadn't spoken to him in years, not since he disappeared after my mother died, but hearing his name tangled in this world made my stomach twist. You're lying, I whispered. He tilted his head, that same calm, devastating certainty in his eyes. I don't lie to my wife. The words echoed again, that dark mantra he seemed to live by. My heart felt like it was splitting open, torn between disbelief and a strange, reluctant gratitude. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to hurt him for what he'd done to me. But beneath all that rage, a quieter voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, he was the only reason I was still breathing. I want to go home, I said finally, my voice breaking. He studied me for a long moment, then said softly, You are home. Something in me snapped. I shoved the chair back, my hands shaking. You don't get to decide that. You don't get to trap me here and call it protection. He rose too, slowly like a storm building, his eyes dark and unreadable. You think I want this? He said, his voice a low growl now. You think I wanted to drag you into my world? You have no idea what I've risked, what I've done to keep you alive. Then let me go. For a heartbeat, silence fell between us, thick and unbearable. Then he stepped closer, his hand reaching for my chin, forcing me to meet his gaze. If I let you go, Isabella, he murmured, his voice low and dangerous, you'll be dead before sunset, and I don't bury what's mine. My breath hitched. I hated the way my body reacted to his closeness, the way fear and something darker twisted together until I couldn't tell them apart. He released me, turning away, his tone calmer again. You'll stay here until it's safe. My men will bring your things. You don't leave this house without me. I wanted to protest, to throw something, to make him see that I wasn't one of his possessions. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because when he looked at me, I saw something raw in his expression, something that looked too much like a promise made in blood. As he walked out, the woman in black cleared the table silently, her eyes flicking toward me just once. He doesn't make vows lightly, she said softly. And when the door closed behind her, I sat there alone in that cold, gleaming room, the silence pressing against my skin, and realized with a sickening chill that Luca Romano hadn't just saved my life. He'd claimed it. And if what he said was true, then somewhere out there was someone who wanted me dead badly enough to start a war. I don't think there are words that can properly describe what it feels like to live inside a cage made of gold and glass, a prison so beautiful that for a moment you almost forget it's a prison at all, until you touch the edges and realize they cut deeper than steel, until you try to breathe and find that the air itself has been rationed, measured, owned by someone else. And that was exactly how I felt in Luca Romano's world, kept, guarded, protected, but never free. Days bled into each other with the slow, deliberate rhythm of captivity. The mansion was vast, with endless hallways and rooms filled with paintings and secrets, each space curated like a museum of a man who didn't want to be understood. The windows looked out onto the city. But even that view felt unreachable, because the glass was bulletproof, tinted to keep prying eyes out, and to keep me in. There were guards outside every door, men in dark suits who didn't speak, who nodded at me with the kind of respect that wasn't real respect at all, but fear borrowed from their master. Luca came and went like a storm, unpredictable, quiet before the chaos, and devastating in his presence. Sometimes I wouldn't see him for hours. Other times, I'd look up and find him in the doorway watching me with that unnerving calm that made my heart thud and my stomach twist, as if he was trying to memorize me, or maybe remind me that I was still his, even in silence. The first time he took me out of the mansion, I thought it might be my chance to escape. But it wasn't freedom. It was control disguised as generosity. He told me we were going to his office. But the car he led me to wasn't just a car. It was a fortress on wheels, the kind of sleek black vehicle that screamed danger without needing to make a sound. 2 men flanked us in the front seats, their gazes fixed forward, their guns visible even beneath their tailored jackets. I sat beside him, hands clenched in my lap, my pulse loud in my ears. He didn't speak at first, just watched the city passing by through the tinted windows. Then after a long silence, he said quietly, "You shouldn't look so scared. No one's going to hurt you while you're with me." I turned to him, unable to hold back the bitterness rising in my throat. "That's the problem, Luca. I'm not afraid of them. I'm afraid of you." He didn't look surprised. He didn't even look offended. He just nodded once, his jaw tightening slightly, as if the truth of it didn't hurt, but was something he'd already accepted long ago. "Fear keeps you alive," he said softly, "and I'd rather you fear me than trust anyone else." There was a cruel kind of logic in that, the sort of twisted reasoning that made sense only in his world, where love and violence were siblings and loyalty was a currency traded in blood. When we arrived at his so-called office, I realized it wasn't an office at all, but a private club, exclusive, silent, filled with men who stopped talking the second he walked in. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of money, and as Luca led me through the room, every eye followed us. Some looked curious, others fearful, and one man sitting at a table in the corner smirked in a way that made my skin crawl. Luca noticed. He always noticed. Before I could even turn my head fully, he was gone from my side, crossing the room with that slow, predatory walk of his, each step deliberate, calculated. The man at the table's smirk faltered, his hands raising slightly in mock surrender. But it didn't matter. Luca leaned down, whispered something into his ear that I couldn't hear, and whatever it was made the man pale instantly. When Luca returned to me, there was no trace of anger on his face, only that eerie calm again. "What did you say to him?" I asked, unable to help myself. He glanced at me. I reminded him that looking at you is the same as signing his own death warrant. My breath caught. "You can't just—" "I can," he said quietly, cutting me off. "And I will. Because this is the only language my world understands. His world, not mine. And yet, no matter how much I wanted to deny it, I was part of it now." Later that night, after we returned to the mansion, I stood in front of one of the tall windows overlooking the city, trying to convince myself that somewhere out there, someone might still be looking for me, that I wasn't completely erased. The lights below flickered like stars trapped in the wrong sky, and the reflection in the glass, my reflection, looked like someone else's. I didn't even recognize the woman staring back at me. That was when I heard his voice behind me. "You shouldn't stand so close to the glass." I turned, startled, but he was leaning against the doorway again, hands in his pockets, watching me with that quiet intensity that felt almost like a touch. "Why?" I asked, my voice sharper than I meant. "Afraid someone will see me?" "Afraid someone might try to shoot you," he said evenly. My stomach dropped. "You're serious?" He stepped closer, the distance between us shrinking until the air felt thick, charged. "There are men who would pay a fortune to put a bullet through anything that belongs to me," he said, his tone steady, almost casual. And right now, that includes you. I wanted to hate the possessiveness in his words, but the fear it stirred in me was real, because I could see it in his eyes. This wasn't some exaggerated warning. It was truth. "Why are they after me?" I whispered. "I didn't do anything." He sighed, and for the first time I saw something like weariness in his expression. "You're a message," he said finally. "To hurt me, they'd go through you. That's how it works." I turned away, unable to look at him. "And this is what you call protection? Keeping me locked up like a pet while the world wants me dead?" "It's better than being dead," he said softly, and though I wanted to scream at him for his simplicity, for the way he reduced my life to a matter of survival, I couldn't ignore the faint tremor in his voice, the ghost of emotion he didn't want me to hear. He moved closer again, until his reflection appeared beside mine in the glass. "I know you hate me," he murmured. "I can live with that. What I can't live with is seeing you buried because of me." Something in his tone cracked through the armor I'd built, and for a heartbeat, I saw not the devil everyone whispered about, but the man beneath. The one who carried his sins like armor, who built walls not out of cruelty but out of necessity. He lifted his hand, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face, and I should have pulled away, should have told him to stop, but I didn't. His touch was warm, grounding, terrifying in how much I didn't want it to end. "Why me, Luca?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Why go this far for someone you don't even know?" His eyes met mine, and for once, there was no mask, no control, only raw truth. "Because the night I found you," he said quietly, "you looked at me like I wasn't a monster." I didn't know how to respond. The silence between us felt like a confession neither of us wanted to make, and when he finally turned and walked away, I was left standing there, trembling, staring at the city lights that suddenly seemed dimmer than before. That night, as I lay awake in the too-soft bed, I kept replaying his words in my mind. That strange, fractured honesty buried beneath his violence, and though I told myself I despised him, some traitorous part of me couldn't forget the look in his eyes when he said he'd rather be hated than see me hurt. But as sleep finally pulled me under, I had no idea that the real danger wasn't outside those walls. It was inside them. Because somewhere, hidden in the shadows of Luca's empire, someone was already watching me. And they weren't watching to protect me. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a house like Luca Romano's. An almost living quiet that hums just beneath the surface, whispering through the marble floors and echoing faintly in the hallways. The kind of silence that makes you feel watched, even when you're completely alone, as if the walls themselves remember every conversation, every cry, every secret ever spoken within them. And in those days that followed, as I drifted like a ghost through the rooms of his mansion, I began to realize that silence wasn't absence, it was surveillance. It was the sound of a world where everything was known and nothing was said aloud. The days had taken on a strange rhythm that didn't belong to me. I'd wake before dawn, drawn from uneasy dreams by the faint sound of men's voices below. Low, measured tones, sometimes in Italian, sometimes in English, sometimes ending with the sharp scrape of a chair or the slam of a door. And I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of business could possibly demand that much secrecy before the sun was even up. Then the house would fall still again, and I'd wander, barefoot and lost, through corridors that seemed to go on forever, each turn revealing something more opulent, more suffocating. There was a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with old leather-bound books that smelled of smoke and time, a piano room that looked untouched for years, a small courtyard filled with white roses that bloomed even in the chill of late autumn, as if the world itself was afraid to let anything die around Luca Romano. And yet, for all its beauty, the house felt hollow, like a museum built over something dark, something buried. I wasn't supposed to go exploring. I knew that. There were rules, unspoken but understood, carried in the weight of the guard's eyes and the way the housekeeper, her name was Elena, watched me with a polite kind of pity whenever I wandered too far. She never said anything cruel, but her silence was its own warning. Some doors, she'd murmured once, her accent thick, should stay closed, Signora. But the thing about cages is that eventually you start looking for cracks, and the thing about secrets is that they call to you even when you know they'll break you. It happened one afternoon, when the house was unusually quiet, and the sun had turned the windows into sheets of pale fire. I was walking down the West Hall, a part of the mansion I hadn't been allowed in before. The air there felt different, cooler, heavier, tinged with something metallic that lingered faintly in the back of my throat. The doors were all closed, thick wood with ornate brass handles that gleamed under the light. And then I saw it. One door slightly ajar, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness inside. I don't know what made me push it open. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the growing need to feel like I had control over something, even if it was just the act of disobeying him. The door creaked softly as I stepped inside, my fingers grazing the wall until they found a switch. The light flickered to life, and what I saw made my stomach twist. It wasn't a room like the others. It was smaller, colder, and on the far wall were photographs, hundreds of them, arranged with precision, each one pinned in neat, deliberate rows. For a moment I thought they were of strangers, but then my knees almost gave out because I saw myself in them. They were pictures of me, some recent, some old, some taken from angles that made it clear they weren't meant to be seen. Me walking to work. Me sitting in a cafe with my friend. Me on the balcony of my apartment, laughing into the wind. Even one of me outside my mother's grave. Every moment, every place captured and frozen. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, my throat closing. I didn't understand. How long had he been watching me? Why? The idea that someone had been following me for months, years maybe, was enough to make my skin crawl. But worse than that was the realization that he had done this. Luca, the man who'd sworn he'd saved me. The sound of footsteps behind me made me spin, my breath catching in my throat. And there he was, standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes locked on mine. "You weren't supposed to see this," he said quietly, and the calm in his voice terrified me more than if he'd shouted. I could barely speak. You were watching me. For how long, Luca? Why would you do that?" He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him, the soft click of the lock echoing in the air. "Long enough to know you were in danger," he said. "Long enough to know they were already watching you too." "What are you talking about?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He moved closer, the dim light catching on the silver at his temples, the lines of exhaustion etched into his face. "You think I'm the only one who had eyes on you? The Carusos had someone following you for months. I intercepted them before they made their move." My heart was racing, confusion and fury tangling in my chest. "So what? This was your version of protecting me? Spying on me like I was your property?" He sighed, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand the kind of men we're dealing with, Isabella. They would have hurt you, used you. I couldn't let that happen." "You couldn't let that happen?" I snapped. "You mean you couldn't control it? You couldn't stand the thought of something happening to what's yours?" The flicker in his eyes was brief but sharp, and for the first time his control cracked. "You think I wanted this?" he said, his voice low and rough. "You think I enjoy the idea of tracking every breath you take just to keep you alive? This is what it takes to protect you. This is what it means to live in my world." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because even through my anger, even through my fear, I could see it. The weight of his words pressing on him. The exhaustion in the way he stood. He wasn't lying. He believed every word he said. He moved to one of the photographs and traced his fingers over it. A picture of me sitting in a cafe, a book in my hand, sunlight in my hair. "This was the day they planned to take you," he said softly. "You never saw the man watching you from across the street." Something cold slid through me. I remembered that day. The unease I'd felt. The sense of being followed that I'd brushed off as paranoia. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered. "Because you wouldn't have believed me," he said simply. "And if I had told you, you would have run, from them or from me, and either way they would have caught you first." The air between us was heavy, too full of things neither of us wanted to say. I looked at the wall again, at all those images of my life stolen piece by piece, and the truth hit me with crushing clarity. Luca hadn't just entered my world, he had been living in its shadows long before I knew his name. I turned away, trying to steady my breathing, but the tears were already burning behind my eyes. "You don't get to decide what's best for me," I said, my voice shaking. "You don't get to rewrite my life just because you think you can protect me." He didn't move, didn't argue. He just said quietly, "I already did." And then, softer, almost to himself, "You'll understand one day, Isabella. You'll see why it had to be this way." I brushed past him, pushing open the door, desperate for air, for distance, for anything that wasn't this suffocating house of secrets. I could feel his gaze on my back as I walked away, the weight of it like chains. But as I turned down the hall, I caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow slipping into another room, too quick to identify. And for the first time, I realized that maybe Luca wasn't the only one watching me in this house. Maybe there were other eyes. Eyes that didn't belong to him. There are moments in life when something inside you shifts, quietly, invisibly, but permanently, like the subtle click of a lock that you don't realize has changed until the door refuses to open again. And I think that's what happened to me after I found that room, after I saw those photographs and felt the crushing weight of Luca's world press down on me like gravity made of secrets. I should have hated him completely by then. I should have looked at him and seen only the monster he claimed to be, the man who stole my freedom and called it protection. But instead, something had begun to stir beneath the anger. A strange, flickering pull that I couldn't smother, as if fear and fascination had fused into something far more dangerous. After that night, I couldn't look at him without seeing the layers underneath. The man behind the weapon, the exhaustion behind the control. There was still fury in me, yes, but it wasn't clean anymore. It had been muddied by the unbearable awareness that every cruel thing he did was shadowed by something he didn't say, something that hovered just out of reach. The house seemed different, too, as though it knew what I'd seen. The guards were tenser, their eyes sharper. Elena avoided meeting my gaze, and even the air itself felt heavier, thicker, as if the mansion was holding its breath. I began to notice small things I'd missed before. The faint click of a camera lens hidden in a hallway corner. The way lights flickered once whenever Luca's car pulled into the garage. The quiet scurry of footsteps that always seemed to vanish when I turned around. It was 2 nights later when it happened. When the spark ignited, though I didn't recognize it as that at first. I couldn't sleep. The clock on the bedside table glowed 2:17 a.m., and the city lights beyond the window shimmered like restless ghosts. My thoughts wouldn't stop turning. The photographs, his words, the shadow I'd seen in the hall. I felt trapped in my own head, suffocating on questions that had no answers. So, against every warning he'd given me, I left the room and wandered down the hall. The mansion at night was a different creature entirely. The silence was thicker, the air colder, and every step echoed like a confession. I walked barefoot, my fingers grazing the walls, following the faint hum of distant noise until I reached the main staircase. That's when I saw the light. It spilled faintly from under a door at the end of the hallway below, golden and low, accompanied by the soft murmur of a voice. Luca's voice. I moved closer, careful, quiet, my heart hammering as I reached the doorway. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see him inside. He was sitting behind a large desk, his suit jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up, the muscles in his forearms tense as he held a gun loosely in his hand, turning it over between his fingers. He was on the phone, his tone cold, deliberate, his words sharp and precise like a blade. "If they touch her again, I'll burn every inch of their territory," he said quietly, and the calm in his voice sent a chill through me. "I don't care what it costs. She's under my protection now." There was a pause, the faint crackle of a response from the other end, and then Luca said something softer, but I couldn't make it out. His free hand rose to his temple, rubbing the space between his brows, and in that moment, he didn't look like the man everyone feared. He looked tired, almost human. I don't know why I pushed the door open. Maybe it was the need to confront him, or maybe it was the strange ache in my chest that wanted to see him without the armor. Either way, the hinges creaked, and his head snapped up instantly, eyes narrowing in warning. "Couldn't sleep," I said, my voice too small for the space between us. He sighed, setting the gun down, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "You shouldn't wander at night." "I could say the same to you," I replied, stepping further into the room, my gaze flicking to the stack of papers scattered across his desk. Documents marked with names I didn't recognize, maps of city blocks, photographs of men with faces that looked more like threats than people. He leaned back in his chair, watching me. "This isn't a world that sleeps, Isabella." "No," I said softly. "It's a world that kills." He didn't argue. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us like something alive. Then he stood, moving to pour a drink from the crystal decanter on the side table. He poured one glass, then hesitated, poured another, and handed it to me. The amber liquid caught the light like fire. I took it, my fingers brushing his, just a fleeting touch. But it sent a pulse of heat through me that I didn't understand. "Tell me something," I said, my voice steadier now. "What do you get out of all this? The fear, the power, the control. What's the point of building a world like this if it just turns to ash in your hands?" He looked at me, his gaze searching, unreadable. "You think I chose this?" he asked quietly. "You think I woke up one day and decided to become what I am? Didn't you?" He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "No. The world I was born into didn't leave room for choices. You either become the predator or the prey, and I swore a long time ago that I'd never be the latter again." Something in his voice cracked on that last word, just enough to make me feel it. I took a slow sip of the drink. It burned down my throat, sharp and smoky, grounding me. "And what about me?" I asked. "Did I get a choice in any of this?" He didn't hesitate. "No," he said, "but I'll make sure you live to hate me for it." It should have made me furious. It should have reignited every ounce of rage inside me. But instead I felt something else. A pull, strange and magnetic. Because in his brutal honesty there was a kind of truth I couldn't ignore. He wasn't pretending to be noble. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was just real. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the faint trace of whiskey and smoke on his breath, close enough that the world seemed to narrow down to the space between us. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then tell me to leave," I whispered. He didn't. For a long, suspended moment, he just looked at me. The kind of look that strips away every wall, every lie, every carefully constructed defense. And then, almost imperceptibly, his hand lifted, his fingers brushing the side of my face, tracing the line of my jaw like he was trying to memorize it. My breath hitched. "Luca," I whispered, but I didn't know what I was asking for. An answer, a warning, or a kiss. He leaned in, his lips just a breath away from mine, his voice low enough that it felt like it sank straight into my skin. "You think you hate me?" he murmured. "But hate isn't what makes you tremble like that." The words hit me harder than any touch could have. My pulse thundered, my mind screaming at me to step back, to remember who he was. But my body didn't listen. His hand slipped to the back of my neck, gentle but unyielding, and for a heartbeat that felt like forever, the distance between us dissolved. But just as his lips brushed mine, the sound of shattering glass cut through the moment. A loud, sharp crash from somewhere down the hall. Luca froze, his expression shifting instantly from desire to danger. The transformation was terrifying to watch, the softness vanishing like it had never existed. He stepped away, grabbing his gun, his tone clipped and lethal. "Stay here." "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding. He didn't answer. He was already gone, moving fast, his footsteps silent despite his size, the air in the room suddenly colder without him. I stood there, frozen, the echo of his touch still burning against my skin, the words he'd whispered replaying in my mind like a curse. And in that moment, surrounded by the ghosts of his secrets and the echo of that crash, I knew something had changed between us, something irreversible. Because I wasn't sure if I wanted him to come back because I was afraid of what might happen without him, or because I was afraid of what might happen when he did. There are sounds that don't just echo in your ears but in your bones, sounds that mark you in ways you can't explain. And that shattering of glass that tore through the stillness of the mansion that night was one of them. A sound that would come back to me later in dreams and memories and moments I'd rather forget. Because it wasn't just the breaking of something fragile, it was the sound of something beginning to unravel, the fragile thread of illusion snapping under the weight of what was always waiting beneath. I remember standing there for what felt like forever, frozen between instinct and fear, my breath caught in my throat, the room still humming with the ghost of what had almost happened between us, the air still tasting faintly of whiskey and want. Luca was gone in seconds, swallowed by the silence of the hall, and though part of me told myself to stay, to do what he'd said, another part, the part that no longer trusted the boundaries of safety, moved anyway. I stepped into the corridor, my bare feet cold against the marble, the faint glow of the sconces painting long shadows across the floor. The sound had come from the east wing, near the back entrance of the mansion. I followed the noise, every creak and whisper magnified by my pulse, until I reached the gallery, a long, open room lined with portraits of long-dead Romanos, their painted eyes following me as I moved. The door at the far end was open, the cold night air seeping through it, and for a heartbeat I saw movement. A flash of black, the glint of metal, a shape that wasn't supposed to be there. And then Luca's voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the air. "Drop it." I stopped, my heart slamming against my ribs. I couldn't see him, but I could hear the low snarl in his tone, the kind of sound that didn't belong to a man, but something older, something primal. There was a pause, a tense silence that stretched too long, and then the sound of a struggle. Footsteps, a grunt, another crash of glass. I flinched as I heard the muffled thud of a body hitting the floor. When I finally stepped closer, Luca was standing over a man pinned beneath him, blood streaking across the marble like spilled ink. The man was gasping, his face pale, his hand reaching for something that wasn't there anymore. His gun, maybe. Luca's boot pressed down hard on his wrist. "Who sent you?" Luca's voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. The man said nothing. He just coughed, blood bubbling at his lips. Luca bent low, murmured something in Italian, and when the man's eyes flicked toward me, just for a split second, Luca snapped his neck like it was nothing. The sound was small, soft even, but it felt like the whole world had gone quiet after it. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth, the bile rising in my throat. I'd known what kind of man he was. I'd known. But knowing something in theory is different than seeing it. Different than watching him end a life without hesitation. He turned toward me then, his eyes darker than I'd ever seen them, his chest rising and falling with restrained fury. "I told you to stay in the room," he said, not shouting, not angry, worse than that. Disappointed. I couldn't speak at first. I just stared at the lifeless body on the floor, the stillness of it, the way the blood looked black in the dim light. "He was unarmed," I whispered, even though I didn't know if that was true. "He was inside my house," Luca said, each word clipped, deliberate. "That makes him armed enough." He grabbed a cloth from the table and wiped his hands, calm, methodical, as if he hadn't just killed someone. Then, almost as an afterthought, he looked at me again. "Are you hurt?" I shook my head. "I'm fine." He took a step closer. "You shouldn't have been here. You shouldn't have killed him." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might actually shout. But instead he let out a slow breath, pinching the bridge of his nose like he was fighting off exhaustion. "You don't understand what this is," he said finally. "That man wasn't some random thief. He was sent by someone who wanted you dead." I swallowed hard. "Then tell me who. Tell me why." He looked at me for a long moment, the muscle in his jaw twitching, his eyes unreadable. "You really want to know?" "Yes." He nodded once, as if bracing himself, and when he spoke, his voice was softer, lower, like he was confessing something that had been rotting inside him for years. "Your father," he said. "It started with him." The words hit me like a physical blow. "My father? What does that even mean?" Luca moved past me, his hand brushing briefly against mine, a touch that felt like an apology and a warning all at once, as he went to close the door. He stood there for a moment, staring out into the night before turning back to me. "Your father was not the man you thought he was," he began slowly. "He worked for the Carusos years ago, before he disappeared. He laundered money for them, passed information, helped cover their tracks. But then he tried to walk away. They don't forgive that kind of betrayal." I could barely breathe. "You're lying." "I wish I was," he said. "He came to me once, a long time ago. Said he wanted out. Said he wanted to protect you. But he'd already sold too many secrets, already buried too many debts. They were going to take you as collateral." I felt the world tilt beneath me. No, that's not possible. My father, he loved me. "I'm not saying he didn't," Luca said, his eyes softer now. "I'm saying love doesn't save anyone in my world. It just gives you something to lose." I turned away, pressing a trembling hand to my chest, trying to make sense of it, trying to hold on to something solid, but everything felt like smoke. My father, the man who'd vanished without explanation, whose absence I'd mourned for years, hadn't been lost to tragedy. He'd been lost to this, to the same darkness that now owned me. I spun back toward him. "If what you're saying is true, then why did you marry me? Why involve me at all?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping briefly to the floor, before meeting mine again. "Because he made me promise," he said quietly, "the night before he died." The air left my lungs. "Before he died?" "He came to me," Luca continued, his voice low, almost distant, as if he was seeing it unfold again in front of him. He knew they were coming for him. He begged me to keep you safe. Said you didn't know anything, that you were innocent. I told him I didn't owe him anything, but he wouldn't stop asking. So I made him a promise that if anything ever happened to him, I'd make sure they couldn't touch you. I stared at him, the pieces falling into place in the worst possible way. You kept your promise, I whispered, my voice breaking, by making me yours. He didn't deny it. He just nodded once, silent, solemn. I sank into one of the chairs, my hands shaking. And what happened to him? There was a pause, a silence so long I almost thought he wouldn't answer. And then he said, barely audible, he died by my hand. The room went still. The world went still. I couldn't even feel my body anymore. All I could feel was the cold spreading through me like poison. You killed him? Luca's eyes were empty. He betrayed me first. He sold information about my operations to the Carusos in exchange for your safety. It didn't matter that he meant well. In my world, betrayal is death. I stood up so fast the chair toppled behind me. You killed my father, I said, my voice shaking, rising, tearing at the edges. And you think that somehow makes you my savior? He took a step forward, his voice firm but desperate. I did what I had to do to protect you, Isabella. Everything I've done since that night, every decision, was to keep you alive. Alive? I laughed, but it came out more like a sob. You call this living? You call this saving me? He didn't move closer this time. He just stood there, his shoulders heavy, his eyes locked on mine with that impossible mix of power and guilt and something that looked a lot like love. I call it survival, he said. And maybe that was the worst part, that even as I stood there shaking, broken open, some part of me believed him. Some part of me hated him for what he'd done. But another part couldn't forget that I was still breathing because of him. But as I turned and walked out, the echo of his voice following me down the hall, I knew something had shifted again. Something permanent and irreversible. Because now I knew the truth about Luca Romano. He wasn't just my captor. He was the man who killed my father, and the man I couldn't stop thinking about. It is a strange and cruel thing, how pain doesn't arrive all at once but in waves, slow and relentless, washing over you again and again until the shore of who you used to be is nothing but ruin. In the days after Luca's confession, I learned that grief was not a moment, it was an ocean. Every breath hurt, every thought burned, and every time I looked at him, I saw not the man who had saved me, not even the man who had claimed me, but the man who had killed my father and then sworn it was mercy. I stopped speaking to him, completely. Silence became my rebellion, my last small weapon in a war I had already lost. He didn't try to force conversation, didn't demand forgiveness or understanding. Instead, he gave me space, though that space felt more like distance carved by guilt than kindness. I avoided his gaze during meals, refused to sit across from him at the long dining table, and spent my days wandering the endless halls of the mansion, like a ghost haunting its own grave. Elena, the housekeeper, watched me with quiet worry, her dark eyes soft but cautious, as though she too knew that something in the air had shifted, something heavy and dangerous. You should eat, she'd say gently, placing food before me that I rarely touched. He won't like seeing you like this. I don't care what he likes, I'd answer, and though the words came out sharp, there was no fire behind them, just exhaustion, the kind that seeps into your bones. But no amount of silence or stubbornness could drown out the thoughts that followed me everywhere, whispering in the corners of my mind. The truth was a living thing now, coiled inside me, reminding me with every breath that the man I had begun to feel something for, the man who had once looked at me like I was the only light in his darkness, was the same man who had ended my father's life. And yet, despite everything, despite the betrayal and the hatred that should have consumed me, My heart betrayed me in quieter ways. I found myself remembering the softness in Luca's voice when he'd said my name, the way his hand had trembled slightly when he brushed the hair from my face, the flicker of pain in his eyes when he told me what he'd done. I hated myself for remembering those things. I hated him more for making me feel them at all. It was on the fourth night after his confession that the world tilted again, proving that whatever fragile peace existed between us was only an illusion waiting to shatter. I was in my room, the curtains drawn, the lamp beside the bed casting a dim golden glow over the pages of a book I hadn't really been reading. The house was quiet, too quiet, and though I'd grown used to the heavy silence that clung to it, something about this quiet was different. It was too still, too thick, as if the air itself had gone tense with warning. Then a sound, soft but distinct, the creak of a floorboard in the hall. I froze, every muscle in my body going rigid. For a moment I thought it might be Luca, though he never came to my room unannounced anymore, not since that night in his office when everything between us had nearly burned alive. But when the handle of the door turned, slow and deliberate, I knew it wasn't him. The door opened just enough for a shadow to slip inside, a figure tall and lean, dressed in black. The light caught the edge of a gun in his hand. I didn't think. I moved. I grabbed the lamp and swung it, the glass shattering against the intruder's arm. He cursed, stumbling back, and that's when I saw his face, young, hard, unfamiliar. Not one of Luca's men. Before I could scream, his hand closed around my wrist, twisting hard enough to make me cry out. "Don't," he hissed, his voice low and sharp. "You scream and I put a bullet through your throat." My heart was pounding so violently I could barely breathe. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. He smirked, though there was nothing kind in it. "Someone who's doing the world a favor," he said. "Dante sends his regards." The name froze the blood in my veins. I remembered it from Luca's world, the Caruso heir, the rival, the ghost whispered about in the same breath as Luca Romano. And now he was here, in this house, in Luca's fortress. "Luca will kill you," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. His grin widened. "He'll try." He yanked me forward, dragging me out into the hall. I tried to fight, tried to pull away, but he was stronger, his grip like iron. My bare feet slipped against the cold marble as he pushed me toward the back stairs. "You don't have to do this," I said, my voice breaking. "If it's him you want, I'm not—" He laughed, a low, humorless sound. "You think this is about him? You're the message, sweetheart, the one thing he can't control." By the time we reached the ground floor, I could hear shouting from somewhere deeper in the mansion, Luca's voice, angry, commanding, the guards, the chaos. The intruder tightened his hold on me, pressing the barrel of the gun against my ribs. "Move," he ordered. But before we could reach the door, it burst open from the other side. 2 of Luca's men stormed in, guns drawn, and in that split second of distraction, I did the only thing I could think of. I slammed my heel into the intruder's knee. He shouted, his grip loosening, and I tore away, stumbling backward. Shots rang out, deafening and sharp. The man went down, one of the guards collapsing beside him, the air thick with smoke and blood. Then Luca appeared. He was a blur of fury and control, his gun raised, his eyes scanning the scene until they found me. "Isabella," he breathed, crossing the distance in seconds. His hands were on my arms, his touch rough, searching. "Did he hurt you?" I shook my head, unable to speak, my chest heaving. His hands cupped my face, his thumbs brushing the tears I hadn't realized had started to fall. "You're safe," he whispered, though the words sounded more like a prayer than a statement. But something inside me snapped at that. At the sight of him, at the smell of blood, at the knowledge that no matter what he promised, I would never be safe in his world. I shoved him back, my voice trembling with rage. Safe? You call this safe? I was almost killed in your house, Luca. His jaw clenched. They got in because someone inside let them, he said, his tone cold now, controlled. And I will find out who. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that maybe this was all his fault, that his enemies were my enemies only because he'd made me part of his world. But before I could, he reached for me again, his voice dropping, softer, urgent. Listen to me. Dante Caruso doesn't make moves without purpose. If he sent someone here, it means he wants you alive. For now. The implication made me dizzy. Why? Luca's eyes darkened. Because he wants to use you to break me. He pulled me close then, his hand gripping the back of my neck. Not in control this time, but in desperation. You don't understand what kind of man he is, he said. He doesn't just kill. He takes. And if he gets his hands on you... He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. That night I was moved to a different room, a smaller one, safer, Luca said, with guards stationed outside the door. I didn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like danger, every shadow like a threat. And somewhere in the dark, I realized something terrible. For all my hatred, for all my anger, the only thing that truly scared me wasn't the thought of Dante Caruso finding me. It was the thought of what Luca would become to keep him from doing it. There are nights that carve themselves into you so deeply that even years later you can still feel them under your skin. The kind of nights where fear and fate tangle so tightly that you can't tell them apart anymore. And that night, the one after Dante Caruso's men broke into the mansion, was one of them. Because it didn't just change how I saw Luca. It changed how I saw myself. I had thought I understood danger, had thought I'd tasted its sharpness in the moment I'd woken up wearing his ring. But what came after that night showed me what it truly meant to be part of a world where life and death were separated by nothing but loyalty. The mansion was no longer quiet after the attack. It breathed differently now, its heartbeat quickened by the tension that rippled through the halls. The guards no longer stood in relaxed silence. They moved like predators, alert, tense, whispering to each other in low Italian, their eyes flicking constantly toward the windows and doors. The lights stayed on through the night, casting long shadows that looked like ghosts moving across the marble. Every sound felt amplified, the metallic click of guns being reloaded, the whisper of boots against stone, the faint hum of security systems being recalibrated. And though I had once hated the silence of this house, now I missed it, because the noise that replaced it was worse. It was the sound of war being prepared. Luca hadn't slept. I saw him once at dawn, standing on the balcony outside his office, his hands gripping the railing so tightly the veins stood out in his arms. He was still in the same dark shirt from the night before, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, dried blood staining the fabric near his wrist. The rising sun painted him in pale gold, but the light did nothing to soften him. He looked carved from stone, immovable, unbreakable. And yet, there was something brittle in the set of his jaw. A quiet violence simmering just beneath the surface. I should have walked away. I should have stayed hidden in whatever room he had ordered me to remain in. But something inside me pulled me toward him anyway. Something I didn't want to name. When he heard the door open, he didn't turn around. You should be resting, he said, his voice low, quiet, controlled. But there was an edge to it, the kind that comes from being too close to breaking. I couldn't sleep, I said, stepping closer. Not after what happened. He was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon, before he finally said, I failed you. The words startled me because they didn't sound like Luca at all. They weren't cold or measured, they were raw, stripped of all the armor he usually wore. I shook my head. You didn't fail me, Someone betrayed you." He laughed, a low, humorless sound. "There's no difference. In my world, a betrayal is only possible because you let someone close enough to commit it." He turned then, and for the first time, I saw the exhaustion in his face, the faint dark circles beneath his eyes, the hollowness of someone who hadn't slept in days. "Dante won't stop," he said. "Not after this. He wants me weak. He wants to hurt me through you, and I can't let that happen again." The intensity in his voice sent a chill through me. "What are you going to do?" He looked at me then, and I could tell by the calm in his expression that whatever he was about to say was already decided. "I'm going to make him bleed," he said simply. Something in his tone terrified me, not because of the violence itself. I had long since accepted that blood was the language of his world, but because of the finality of it. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only the quiet certainty of a man who had already accepted what he'd have to sacrifice. "Luca," I said, my voice trembling despite myself. "If you do this, if you start a war with him, it won't end with just him. It'll never end." He stepped closer, his hand brushing lightly against my cheek, his thumb tracing the edge of my jaw. "You don't understand," he said softly. "It already started the moment they stepped into this house." His touch was gentle, but there was a heaviness in it, a kind of unspoken farewell. I wanted to tell him to stop, to let it go, but I knew he couldn't. Men like Luca didn't know how to stop once the blood oath had been made. Revenge wasn't just justice in his world. It was survival, identity, religion. Later that day, I found him in the underground garage, surrounded by men in black suits loading weapons and gear into unmarked cars. He was giving orders in rapid Italian, his voice steady but sharp, his presence commanding absolute obedience. When he saw me, he paused, the smallest flicker of something, surprise, maybe regret, passing through his eyes. "You shouldn't be down here," he said, walking toward me. "Then stop leaving me out of everything," I shot back. "I deserve to know what you're doing." He stopped a few feet away, studying me for a moment before sighing. "I'm doing what has to be done. You know that." "Do I?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Because all I see is a man who thinks killing enough people will somehow make this better." His expression hardened, but not in anger, more like pain. "I don't kill for pleasure, Isabella," he said quietly. "I kill because it's the only language they understand. If I don't strike first, they'll keep coming. And next time, they won't stop until they have you." His words hit me like a slap. "So what? You'll just keep spilling blood until you've drowned everyone who looks at me the wrong way?" He closed the distance between us in a single step, his hand gripping the back of my neck, firm but not cruel. "Until there's no one left who dares to try," he said, his voice a whisper that was somehow both a promise and a curse. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The air between us was electric, thick with everything we hadn't said. Then I did something reckless. I reached up and pressed my hand against his chest, feeling the heartbeat beneath, steady and strong and terrifyingly human. "And when it's over?" I asked. "When the blood dries and there's no one left to fight? What will you have then?" He looked down at me, his expression unreadable, his breath brushing against my skin. "You," he said simply, "if I'm lucky." The honesty of it hurt more than anything else could have. I wanted to hate him, to scream at him, to tear away from the gravity that kept pulling me toward him, but I couldn't move. Because beneath all the violence, beneath all the lies and betrayals, there was something between us that felt too real to ignore. A terrible, consuming bond forged not in love, not yet, but in survival and fire. When he left that night, I watched from the window as the cars disappeared down the long drive, their headlights slicing through the darkness like blades. The house felt colder after he was gone, emptier in a way that scared me. Hours passed. I sat on the bed, staring at the clock, waiting for any sound, any sign. Then the call came. Elena burst into the room, her face pale, her voice shaking. "Signora," she said breathlessly, "there's been an attack." My blood turned to ice. "Luca? He's alive," she said quickly, "but he's hurt. They ambushed them near the docks. He took a bullet meant for one of his men." I didn't think. I just ran. Down the stairs, out into the night, past the guards who shouted my name. By the time I reached the car that had just pulled in, my heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. They were carrying him out, his shirt soaked in blood, his skin pale under the harsh lights. His eyes found mine even through the haze of pain, and he tried to speak, his lips barely moving. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice faint but steady. "Told you I'd always protect you." And then his eyes fluttered shut. The world spun. I remember shouting his name, my hands covered in his blood, the sound of chaos around me, the medics, the orders, the panic. But all I could see was him. The man I should have hated, bleeding because of me. It was in that moment, kneeling on the cold marble floor, his blood warm on my hands, that I realized the truth I'd been running from since the day I woke up with his ring on my finger. I didn't just fear Luca Romano, I loved him. And that terrified me more than anything ever could. There are moments when time seems to fracture, when every second stretches into forever, and you can feel your life folding in on itself, rearranging around something you never asked for, but can no longer deny. And that was what it felt like as I sat in the dim light of the study that night, my hands still stained faintly with Luca's blood, the scent of antiseptic and iron clinging to my skin, the silence of the mansion broken only by the soft, distant hum of rain against the windows. He was alive. They said that much. But the words didn't feel like enough. Not when I could still see his face as they carried him past me, pale and slick with sweat. His breath shallow, his blood pooling darkly beneath him like a shadow that refused to leave. They told me he'd lost a lot of blood, that the bullet had gone clean through his side, missing anything vital by inches, that he'd been lucky, as if luck had anything to do with survival in a life like his. I stayed outside his room while they worked on him, refusing to move, my body locked in a kind of numbness that hurt worse than pain. I don't know how long I sat there. An hour, a day, a lifetime. But when the door finally opened and one of his men stepped out, his expression heavy, his shirt still splattered with dried crimson, I could barely stand. "He'll make it," the man said quietly, his tone respectful, careful. "He's strong." Strong. That word felt too small for Luca, too human, because the truth was that Luca Romano didn't survive. He endured. He conquered. He commanded life itself to keep him breathing. And yet seeing him like that, broken, vulnerable, stripped of all his control, did something to me that I couldn't explain. It hollowed me out and filled me with something else all at once. A cocktail of fear, guilt, and something darker. Something I didn't want to name because if I did, it would become real. When I was finally allowed inside, the sight of him nearly brought me to my knees. He was lying on the bed, shirtless, the bandages around his torso stark against the tanned skin, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. The room smelled of alcohol and blood, and there was a faint tremor in his hand even as he slept, his fingers curling slightly as if reaching for something unseen. I wanted to reach for him too, wanted to take that hand and hold it, to tell him that he wasn't alone, but I couldn't. Not yet. I sat in the chair beside the bed, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, staring at him as the minutes slipped by, trying to reconcile the two versions of him that now existed in my mind. The monster and the man, the killer and the protector. The one who had taken everything from me and the one who, somehow, I couldn't imagine losing. "Why do you keep doing this?" I whispered, not expecting an answer. "Why do you keep giving me reasons to hate you and love you in the same breath?" His eyes opened slowly, dark lashes fluttering against his cheeks, before those impossible eyes fixed on me. He was awake, groggy but aware, his voice rough and low when he spoke. "You're still here," he said, and somehow, even half-conscious, he managed to make it sound like both an accusation and a relief. "I couldn't leave," I said simply, though part of me wanted to scream that I'd tried, that every cell in my body wanted to run as far away from him as possible. But the other part, the part that betrayed me every time he looked at me, had rooted me there. He tried to sit up, a groan escaping his lips, and I stood quickly, pressing a hand to his chest. "Don't," I said sharply. "You'll reopen the wound." His hand caught mine, his grip weak but insistent. "You shouldn't be this close to me, Isabella," he murmured, his eyes burning into mine. "Not after everything I've done." I shook my head, the words coming out before I could stop them. "You think I care about that right now? You almost died, Luca." He gave a faint, pained smile. "I've almost died before." "That's not the point." My voice cracked on the words, and I turned away, trying to hold myself together. "You can't just keep doing this, risking everything, throwing yourself into danger like your life means nothing. You can't keep—" He interrupted me, his tone quiet but certain. "My life doesn't mean anything if I can't protect you." I froze, my breath catching. The rain outside had grown heavier, the sound of it filling the silence between us. And for a long moment, neither of us spoke. I could feel the pull of him, that familiar, terrible gravity that always seemed to draw me closer no matter how much I wanted to resist it. "Don't say things like that," I whispered finally. "You don't get to make me responsible for your choices." He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes again, and for a moment I thought he'd fallen asleep. But then he said, "I made a vow the night your father died. A blood oath. I swore that I would protect you until my last breath, even if it meant losing everything else. That's what this is, Isabella. It's not obsession. It's a promise I can't break." His words hit me like a blow. A blood oath. The phrase itself felt ancient, sacred, terrible. "So I'm just a vow to you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "A debt you're repaying in blood?" He opened his eyes, and in them I saw something that looked like regret and longing all at once. "You were never a debt," he said softly. "You were the only thing in my life that wasn't one." I didn't know what to say. Every word I could think of felt too small, too fragile for the weight of what hung between us. So I just sat there, my heart beating too fast, my mind spinning with everything we'd become. Two people bound together by violence and loss, unable to untangle love from ruin. Days passed, and though Luca began to recover, the world outside the mansion grew darker. Dante Caruso hadn't disappeared. He'd grown bolder. There were whispers among the guards, intercepted messages, missing shipments, bribes offered to Luca's men. Even the air in the house seemed different now, thick with the scent of waiting, of something coming. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, I went to check on Luca and found him sitting in his office, half-dressed, the bandage around his torso visible through the open collar of his shirt. He was staring at the marriage certificate, our marriage certificate, laid out on the desk before him. "I can end this," he said when he noticed me, his voice quieter than usual, almost uncertain. "If you want to go, I'll let you. I'll make sure you're protected. You can disappear, start over somewhere no one will find you." For a heartbeat, I thought I'd misheard him. "You'd let me go?" He nodded slowly. If that's what you want. I've taken too much from you already. The words should have set me free, should have filled me with relief, but instead they felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Because the truth was that somewhere along the way, freedom had become just another kind of prison, the kind without him in it. I stepped closer, my voice barely a whisper. And if I don't want to go? His gaze met mine, unreadable. Then you stay, he said simply, and you become part of this world for real. No more pretending you're just a bystander. My breath caught. You mean? I mean you stand beside me, he said, his tone steady, his eyes dark and searching. As my wife, in every way that word means, the world already thinks you are. Maybe it's time you decide if you are too. The room felt suddenly too small, the air thick and electric, and I could feel my pulse in every inch of my body. I wanted to speak, to answer him, to tell him what I felt. But before I could, a noise shattered the moment, a gunshot, distant but close enough to shake the window glass. Luca was on his feet instantly despite his injury, grabbing the gun from his desk drawer, his voice sharp and commanding. Stay here. But I didn't listen. I followed him into the hall, my heart pounding, the sound of shouting echoing from somewhere near the courtyard. We turned the corner, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Elena was on the ground, blood pooling beneath her hand outstretched toward us, her lips forming words that never came. And behind her, framed in the open doorway, stood Dante Caruso himself, smiling, gun in hand, his eyes fixed on Luca. Hello, wife, he said, his voice smooth, mocking. I believe congratulations are in order. Luca raised his gun, and in that suspended second before the world exploded into violence again, I realized that no matter how this ended, nothing in me, or between us, would ever be the same. There are moments when time stops, not in the peaceful, cinematic way people describe, but in the brutal, suffocating stillness that comes when everything you've ever feared collides in a single heartbeat. And that was what it felt like when Dante Caruso stood in the doorway of Luca's mansion, his gun gleaming under the cold light, Elena's body lying motionless on the marble floor, and Luca standing in front of me like a wall of flesh and fury, his weapon already raised, his expression carved from stone. The world had narrowed to the sound of my heartbeat and the faint hiss of rain outside, every breath suspended between life and death. Put it down, Dante, Luca said, his voice low, calm, deadly, the kind of calm that meant something terrible was about to happen. Dante smiled, a sharp, cruel curve of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. Now why would I do that? You've taken enough from me already, Romano. I thought I'd come to return the favor. The air between them crackled with the weight of history, with grudges older than either of them cared to admit. I could feel it in the way Luca's shoulders tensed, in the way Dante's gaze flicked briefly to me, and then back again, as if he enjoyed seeing the confusion and terror twist inside me. She doesn't belong in this, Luca said, taking a slow step forward. Oh, but she does, Dante replied softly, his gun tilting just slightly toward me. You made her part of this. You made her your wife, remember? The world knows it, and that means she's fair game now. You built a kingdom out of fear, and you thought you could protect her inside it. But tell me, Luca, how does it feel watching it crumble because of her? Luca moved before I could even process it, faster than I thought possible given his injuries. The sound of gunfire erupted, loud and violent, echoing off the marble walls, shattering the fragile tension that had been holding everything together. I dropped to the ground instinctively, my hands covering my ears as the chaos unfolded above me. Men shouting, bullets tearing through the air, the smell of gunpowder thick and choking. When the noise finally died, the silence that followed was deafening. My heart hammered against my ribs as I lifted my head, my breath catching in my throat. Dante lay on the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest, his eyes wide and glassy. The gun was still in his hand, his fingers twitching once before going still. Luca stood a few feet away, his chest heaving, blood seeping through the bandage at his side again. His gun slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I was on my feet, running to him, catching him just as his knees buckled. "Luca," I breathed, my hands gripping his face, my voice trembling as I felt the heat of his blood on my palms. "Stay with me. Please stay with me." He managed a weak smile, one corner of his mouth lifting. "You never listen when I tell you to stay put," he murmured, his voice rough but steady. Tears blurred my vision. "You're losing too much blood. You need—" He cut me off with a shake of his head, his hand rising to touch my cheek, his fingers trembling. "It's over," he said softly. "Dante's gone. It's done." I shook my head, refusing to accept the finality in his tone. "No. Don't you dare say it's done. You're not done. You don't get to leave me now." He laughed then, quiet and broken, the sound of it catching in his chest. "You sound like me," he whispered, "when I thought I could stop the world from taking you." The tears spilled over, hot and relentless. "You can't die on me, Luca," I said, my voice cracking. "Not after everything, not after you made me love you." His eyes softened at that, his thumb brushing a tear from my face. "You love me," he said, not as a question, but like a confession he'd been waiting his whole life to hear. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "I didn't think I'd ever hear that," he said, his breath shallow. "Not from anyone, not after everything I've done." "Then live," I whispered fiercely. "Live and make it mean something." He closed his eyes for a moment, his hand still against my skin, his pulse faint but there. "You were never supposed to be part of this world," he said quietly. "You were supposed to be free. That was the promise I made to your father, that I'd keep you safe no matter what it cost me. And now I understand what he meant when he said that love was the most dangerous thing of all." "Don't you dare make this about promises," I said, my voice trembling with anger and grief. "You promised me 1,000 things, Luca. You promised to protect me, to keep me safe, but you never promised to stay. Promise me now." He smiled faintly, his hand slipping to the back of my neck, pulling me closer. "I promise," he whispered, "but you have to promise me something too. Anything. Don't let them turn you into me." The words shattered me. I wanted to scream, to tell him he was wrong, that I wasn't him, that I couldn't be, but deep down I knew what he meant. His world had a way of devouring people, of turning love into leverage, loyalty into weapons. He didn't want that for me. The sound of footsteps filled the hall, the guards, the medics, the noise of people rushing to the aftermath. But in that moment, it all faded. It was just him and me. The world narrowed to the warmth of his skin and the weight of everything we hadn't said. They took him to the hospital, of course. He survived, barely. And though the doctors said he'd walk again, they also said the damage would never fully heal. The empire he'd built began to unravel in his absence, the pieces scattered and reformed under the control of those he once commanded. But Luca didn't seem to care. When he finally came home weeks later, he was quieter, softer somehow, as if something inside him had been stripped away, leaving only the man beneath the legend. We didn't talk about Dante. We didn't talk about my father, or the blood that bound us, or the promises that had destroyed us both. We didn't have to. The silence between us was no longer heavy with secrets. It was something else now. Something fragile. Something that felt for the first time like peace. One evening, months later, I found him standing in the garden, the same one that had once been filled with white roses but was now wild and overgrown, the petals pale ghosts under the moonlight. He turned when he heard me, his expression unreadable. the faintest trace of a smile touching his lips. You ever think about what would have happened if we'd met another way? I asked quietly. He took a long breath, his gaze drifting toward the sky. Every day, he said. But I think the ending would have been the same. Some people are just meant to collide. I stepped closer, reaching for his hand. And destroy each other? Or save each other, he said softly. Sometimes it's the same thing. We stood there for a long time, the night stretching around us, the sound of distant waves carried on the wind. I realized then that love, the kind we shared, was never meant to be gentle. It was a storm, a wildfire, a beautiful, ruinous thing that burned everything it touched. And maybe that was what made it real. Because in the end, I had learned that love in his world was not about happy endings. It was about survival, about finding something worth holding on to in the darkness, about looking at the person who had both broken and saved you, and knowing you'd do it all over again. He squeezed my hand, his voice low but steady. You know what's strange? He said. I spent my whole life trying to keep you safe. And now, when I look at you, I think you might be the only thing keeping me alive. I smiled, the kind of smile that hurt, the kind that felt like both an ending and a beginning. Then we'll just have to keep saving each other, I whispered. And as the wind moved through the garden, carrying the scent of roses and rain, I realized that though our story had been born in violence and blood, it had somehow found its way to something resembling peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from forgiving, from learning to live with the scars. Because love, the dangerous kind, doesn't end when the gunfire stops or the vows fade. It lingers, it reshapes, it survives. And as I leaned against him beneath the dark sky, I knew that ours always would.